Let's stop for a moment and do a little refactoring. So when we are choosing activity by using this select box, we're gonna fire custom events to parent component so it can properly update timeline item object and assign ID of selected activity to this activity ID property. And one of the events that gets sent to root component is called set timeline item activity within the timeline component. And along with this event, we also send two additional objects. One of them is timeline item object, for which we should update activity, and another object is activity itself. But instead of doing all this in one object, we can also pass separate parameters. Like so, second parameter will be timeline item object, and the third parameter will be activity object. That of course we receive as a payload from child component as event variable. And of course, after doing this change, we also have to tweak set timeline item activity validation function. Because now we're passing two separate parameters, so let's change the declaration in here and specify two separate arguments, timeline item and activity. And of course, the event handler function within root component app.vue, which is going to handle this event, set timeline item activity. Now this function is also going to receive two separate arguments. So let's modify function declaration properly. And now, just to make sure that we haven't broken anything after doing all this refactoring, let's do one run in the browser. So firstly, we're choosing activity. And after that, activity ID property should receive activity identifier, which we can see right here. And of course, proper timeline item object within timeline items array of root component was also updated. Because technically this is the same timeline item object that gets passed as a prop to all timeline item components. And when we are resetting value of the select box, we'll see that this property will be assigned null value. So now let's continue doing our refactoring and switch over to timeline item component. As a reminder, when we select activity by using that select box, the first thing that gets executed is this select activity handler function, which receives ID of selected activity. So in the browser, when we choose activity, we see right away that activity ID property was assigned activity identifier, and after resetting value of this select box, activity ID property receives null value. So when we select activity within that select box, this part of expression will return activity object that is found by ID. Otherwise, when we reset activity, this expression will return undefined, and we're gonna fall back to null. And just because of that, if we take a look at select activity validation function, it does not really make much logical sense. Because here, in order to validate activity, we're using two different validation functions. First of all, we are verifying if activity variable is null, and also here we are verifying that activity variable is indeed valid activity object. And in my opinion, it will be much better if these two checks can be executed within one function. So we're going to move isNull check within isActivityValidValidation function within validators.js. And as a first statement of this function, we're checking if activity variable is null. In this case, we assume that activity will be valid, so we're returning true. But since there is no activity variable in here, we have to check ID property. So when it's null, we will assume that activity is valid. And then we're going to create so-called null activity object, which will represent empty activity, where ID property will be null. And instead of returning null value in here, we're going to return this nullable activity object, which will also allow us to get rid of some additional checks within app component. Specifically within this set timeline item activity function, because activity variable will always contain valid activity object, which will always have ID property. So there is no need to use this optional chaining operator in here anymore, and also fall back to null value. We could just easily rewrite this in the following form, by using normal assignment without any additional null checks. So to make it possible right here, we no longer can return simple null value. Instead, we're going to return nullable object, which is going to represent empty activity. And after that, let's switch over to constants.js and declare this new constant, nullable activity. It is going to be a simple object with only one property, ID, with the value of null. And this will be a shape of our nullable activity object. And now, just to follow separation of concerns principle in our functions, we're going to extract this logic, which is looking for activity object by its ID, in a separate function, which we're gonna call find activity by ID, passing ID of the activity we're looking for. So down here, let's create new function with the name find activity by ID, paste in here all the code we just cut. Let's not forget and also declare one parameter, ID. And now that validation function for select activity event can be drastically simplified. And since now isNullCheck is being done within isActivityValid function, instead of using all these rules, we can simply use isActivityValid function. And now all the checks related to validating activity, they are consolidated within isActivityValid function. So there is no need to import isNull function within timeline item component. Let's remove this import. And instead import our new nullable activity object that we have just added to constants module. So now once select activity event is fired and sent to parent component, in the parent component we can see that when this event gets received, we're going to fire another custom event set timeline item activity back to the root component. And as one of the rules to validate payload of this event, we have used isNull function. So there is no need to do it anymore, because isNullCheck is already contained within isActivityValid function. So we can simply remove it from here. Along with that, we're also removing isNull function import from here. And finally, we can go back to app component and remove this commented line, because now this function will always receive activity object as activity parameter that will always contain ID property. And this ID property will be either number or null. So now it's enough to do just basic assignment without any additional checks. Let's switch back to the browser and try to select activity by using first select box. And after doing that, in the console we can see that we receive an error, which is happening within isActivityValid function. So let's figure out what is going on in here. Go back to timeline item component. And that error actually happens because our findActivityById function does not return anything. That is simply because I have missed return keyword in here. Let's add it and check everything again. As we can see now, after I select activity, we're gonna get activity ID assigned to activity ID property of timeline item object, which is of course reflected in the original timeline item object within parent component. And then of course every object from this timeline items array gets sent as a prop to every timeline item component. And when we're going to reset value of the select box, activity ID property of the particular timeline item object will receive null value. And of course it was also reflected in original timeline item object within timeline items array of the root component. So after doing all this refactoring, we have made the process of selecting activity for a particular hour a little more intuitive. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.